At 71, Nadine had spent her whole life nursing other people through their last days, and she believed that would count for something with her only son. It did not. Wesley sold the house she had signed over to him years before and told her she had 30 days to be out. She left with $400, one suitcase, and a small carved bird she had carried in her coat pocket for half her life. 2 counties over, down a dirt road nobody had a reason to drive, she found it. A sagging forest house going cheap because the old man who lived there had died alone, and the people in town swore the place was unlucky. She counted out the last of her money and bought it anyway. Then, behind a loose wall in the root cellar, she found what that old man had spent 30 years hiding from the world. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me take you back to the kitchen, where it started, because you need to see how a woman gets to 71 and ends up on a dirt road with everything she owns in a single bag. It was a Tuesday in the middle of November when Wesley came to tell her. Nadine knew something was wrong the second he walked in, because he used the front door. Her son had not used the front door since he was a boy. He came in through the kitchen his whole life, dropping his keys in the blue bowl by the stove, and now he stood in the front hall with his coat still on, holding a folder against his chest like a shield. "Sit down, Ma," he said. "We need to talk." She was already sitting. She had been shelling pecans into a bowl for the pie she made every year for the church, working the meat out whole the way her mother taught her. She set the nutcracker down and waited. 5 decades of nursing had taught her that when a person cannot get to the point is usually terrible. "The house is sold," Wesley said. He said it fast, like ripping tape. "I signed the papers Friday. The new people take it the 15th of December. I'm sorry. I did everything I could." Nadine looked at the bowl of pecans. She looked at the kitchen she had cooked in since she was a young bride, the counter where she had rolled out 10,000 biscuits, the window over the sink where she had watched that same boy learn to ride a bike and fall and get back up. Then she looked at her son. "This is my house," she said, quiet. She was not a woman who raised her voice. "It's in my name, Ma, has been since 2009. You signed it over to me, remember, to protect it. So the nursing home couldn't come after it, so the tax people couldn't." He would not meet her eyes. "I need you to remember that you agreed to that." She did remember. A young man had sat at this very table with a lawyer's pamphlet, so earnest, so worried about her, explaining how folks lost everything to one bad year of illness, how the smart thing, the loving thing, was to put the house in his name and let him watch over it for her. She had trusted him because he was her son, and trusting him was the only thing she had ever known how to do. "Why?" she said. Not a question, really. Just the word laid on the table between them. Wesley's jaw worked. "The business went under. A couple of winters back. I didn't want to tell you. There was a second mortgage. There were people I owed. It got away from me. It just got away from me, and this was the only thing left that could cover it." He finally looked up, and his eyes were wet, and somehow that was the worst part. "You'll be okay. You're always okay. You're the toughest person I ever met." There it was. The lie that let him do it. If she was always okay, then leaving her with nothing was not really leaving her with nothing. It was trusting her to survive it, which is what a man tells himself when he needs a mother to bleed so he can breathe. She thought about the winters she had walked to work in the dark because the car would not start. So there would be money for his cleats. There were the double shifts the Christmas Eve spent holding a stranger's hand while that stranger died so a family would not have to. The morning she came home at dawn and made him pancakes and never once said she was tired. None of it reached her mouth. Saying it out loud would have turned her love into a bill, and she had never let it be a bill. 30 days, she said instead. "About that, I'm sorry." He set the folder on the table and slid it toward her, full of papers she would not read. "I really am." Then he left through the front door, because the kitchen door belonged to a version of him that no longer existed, and Nadine sat alone with a bowl of pecans and the sound of his truck backing down the drive. She did not cry. She would tell you later she was too busy, and there was truth in that, but the deeper truth was simpler. He took the house. He could not take the 50 years of hands that had built everything in it, and a woman who still has her hands is not finished yet. That night she packed, and it did not take long, which shamed her a little. A person spends 7 decades on this earth, and it fits in one suitcase and 2 grocery bags. Into the bags went her clothes, her Bible, a photograph of her mother, and the good scissors. The good dishes she left behind because there was no room, and because she found she did not want them. And into the pocket of her wool coat, where it always rode, she tucked the small carved bird. It was a wren, no bigger than the top of her thumb, cut from pale wood gone amber with handling, its head tipped and its tail cocked up the way a real wren holds itself. She had carried it for 34 winters, and she did not know who made it. The story of the wren was the oldest ache she owned. When Wesley was 7 months old, his father was killed at the quarry, a wall of shale that let go without warning and took 3 men with it. Nadine was 26, a widow with an infant, and $40 in a company that offered its condolences, a final check, and nothing else. She could not pay for the funeral. She sat in a cold rented room and did the math over and over, and it never came out, and she was too proud to tell a soul. Then, one morning there was an envelope on the porch step. No name on it. Inside was $300 in one bills, more money than she had ever seen in one place, and a note in careful block letters that said only, "For the baby in the winter." Wrapped in the same paper was the little carved wren. That money buried her husband and bought coal and kept the two of them alive until spring. And she never learned who left it, she asked. Nobody knew. After a while, she stopped asking and started carrying the bird, and somewhere in the years it stopped being a mystery and became a companion, a small wooden reminder that once, when she had nothing, the world had reached out a hand she could not see. She held it now in the dark of the house that was no longer hers, and she made up her mind she would not go to a shelter. Sleeping on a church friend's couch, watching the pity gather in the corners of their kindness, was worse than any cold. She had spent her whole life being the one who showed up for other people, and being shown up for was a language she had never learned to speak. So she would go home. Not the city. The city had only ever been where the work was. Home was the county she came from, up where the land folded into hills and the roads turned to gravel, where she had been a girl and a young wife and a young widow before she carried her baby down to the flat country to find a job that paid. She had not been back in more than 4 decades. Nothing waited there, no family, no house standing open. But it was the only ground that had ever felt like it belonged to her, and at 71 a woman is allowed to want to stand on ground like that. She sold the car for $1,100 to a man who barely looked at her, kept $400 for the road, wired the rest into an account, and got on a bus. The county had changed, and it had not. The bus let her off in a town called Marlow, smaller than she remembered. A main street of maybe a dozen storefronts with half of them dark. But the mountains behind it were the same mountains, blue and patient, and the air carried the same cold mineral smell of creek water and wood smoke, and something in her chest that had been clenched since Tuesday let go a notch. She took a room over the hardware store by the week and started asking about the cheapest place a person could buy. That was how she found the diner, and that was how she found Odessa. The diner had 6 stools and 4 booths and a hand-lettered sign that said, "We are open when we are open." Odessa ran it, a broad woman near Nadine's own age, with iron-gray hair pinned up in forearms like a farmhand, and she took one look at the stranger in the good wool coat with the suitcase and said, "Sit down before you fall down. Coffee's on the house until you tell me your business." Nadine sat. She told the short version, a widow looking to buy small and cheap and be left alone. Odessa poured coffee and listened the way a woman listens who has heard every kind of trouble come through a door. "Cheap and small," Odessa said. "And you don't mind fixing." It was not a question. "I have fixed worse than a house." Odessa studied her a moment, then wiped her hands on her apron and leaned on the counter. "There's the Bly place, up the Ridge Road, about 4 miles out. Old Emmett Bly lived there most of his life and died there last spring, and nobody's touched it since. County's selling it for back taxes. It'll go for near nothing." She paused. "I'll be honest, because you seem like a woman who'd rather have it straight. Folks won't buy it." "Why not?" Odessa refilled the cup Nadine had not emptied. Emmett kept to himself, more than kept to himself. Went whole seasons without coming to town. When he did come, he barely said 10 words, paid cash, and went home. He was the undertaker here, did you know that? Most of his life. Buried half the county. She shrugged. Then he died up there alone, and nobody knew for the better part of 2 weeks. There's talk the place is unlucky. I don't hold with it, but talk is talk, and talk keeps the price down. Nadine turned the coffee cup in her hands. An old undertaker who kept to himself and died alone, in a house nobody wanted, on a ridge above a town she used to know. It should have frightened her. It did not. She had washed and dressed more bodies than she could count, and held the hands of the dying until those hands went cold, and she had never once carried anything home but grief and grief she could carry. "How much is near nothing?" she asked. 200-300 at the county building would take it. Nobody's bidding against you, that's certain. Odessa's face softened. "It needs work. The roof leaks, and the well's a question mark. You'd be up there alone 4 miles from the nearest soul. That's a hard thing at any age and a harder one at ours." "I've been alone in a full house," Nadine said. 4 miles of quiet doesn't scare me." Odessa laughed, a real laugh that came up out of her belly. "No," she said. "I don't believe it does." The county building took $280 and most of an afternoon. A board clerk slid papers across a counter, told her twice that the property was sold as is, where is, no inspection and no guarantees, and looked at her the whole time like a woman about to make a mistake she was too old to walk back from. Nadine signed. In return, she got a key, old iron gone orange with rust, and the deed to her life folded into a plain envelope. And just like that, she owned a house again. She hired a man with a truck to carry her out, because there was no other way, and paid him $20 she could not spare. The ridge road climbed out of town, turned to gravel, then narrowed to 2 ruts of packed dirt with grass grown up the middle, winding back through the trees until the trees closed over it. The man drove slow and said nothing and plainly wanted to be gone. Then the ruts opened into a clearing, and there it was. The house was smaller than she had pictured, and older, a squat cabin of dark logs with a stone chimney and a porch that sagged on the downhill side like a tired shoulder. A shed stood off to the side, with its door hanging open. The yard grass was knee-high and brown and beaten down in one curving track, the kind of path a thing makes when it walks the same line every day. Above it all, the mountain rose dark with pines, and the quiet when the truck engine died was so total that it rang. "This is it," the man said, already lifting her bags onto the porch. I'll wait while you look. Make sure you can get in." "I can get in," Nadine said. "Thank you." He did not argue. He set the last bag down, tipped his cap, and drove off faster than he had come. And she stood alone in the yard with the key in her hand and the light already going golden low behind the ridge. The door stuck, then gave. Inside the house smelled of cold ash and dust, and underneath, faintly of cedar. One big room made up most of it, a wood stove at its heart, a plank table, 2 chairs, a bed frame against the far wall, and shelves everywhere holding the ordinary leavings of a life nobody had claimed. A tin cup sat on the table with a ring of old coffee dried in the bottom. A coat hung on a peg by the door. It was the home of a man who had stepped out and meant to come back. And Nadine felt the tenderness she always felt in the rooms of the recently dead, the sense of a life interrupted in the middle of a sentence. She lit the lamp she found by the door, got a fire going in the stove with dry wood from the box, and set about making the place fit for one night. She swept out a corner and wiped down the table. The old mattress got a beating before she unrolled her bedding on the frame. Her body ached and her mind was quiet, and for the first time in a week she felt almost like herself, a woman with a task in front of her and the hands to do it. It was full dark when she heard the sound outside. She went still. A scratching, low, then the soft thud of something moving on the porch, then the scratching again. She carried the lamp to the window and looked out, and 2 eyes caught the light and held it, low to the ground, amber and unblinking. It was a dog, a big rangy thing, part shepherd by the look of it, its coat matted and its ribs showing, standing at the edge of the porch light with mud to the knees and burrs in its tail. It did not come closer, and it did not run. It just watched her through the glass with a look she could only call waiting, as though she were late for something it had been expecting a long while. "Well?" Nadine said softly to the window. "Whose are you?" The dog gave no answer, but when she opened the door a crack, it did not bolt. It backed off 2 steps, held its ground at the foot of the porch stairs, and looked at her, and then it looked pointedly toward the far corner of the house where a low door stood shut in the fieldstone foundation, and it looked back at her again. She did not go out to it that night. The cold and the tiredness decided that for her, and a strange dog in the dark was a thing best met in daylight. She left a heel of bread on the step, shut the door, and went to bed, and she slept better than she had in years, the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman finally alone with nothing left to lose. She woke before dawn to the sound of it again. Not barking, scratching, slow and steady, and coming, she realized as she lay in the gray light, not from the porch this time, but from below her, from the stone-walled root cellar under the far corner of the house. She rose, pulled her coat on over her nightgown, lit the lamp, and went to look. The cellar door was the low one in the foundation, and it stood open now, though she was certain she had not opened it. Down 4 stone steps the air turned cold and earthen. Barrow, though she did not yet know to call him that, stood in the corner with his nose pressed to the seam where 2 sections of old plank wall met, and he was scratching at the boards with one paw, steady and deliberate. And when he saw her he stopped, and looked at her, and then back at the wall, and he whined low in his chest, the sound an animal makes when it knows a thing the people have not figured out yet. Nadine came down the last step and held the lamp up. The wall was just a wall, old gray boards nailed over the stone to make a bin for potatoes and jars, but the dog would not leave it. And now that she was close, she could see the boards in that one section were not like the others. The nail heads were newer. The seam ran too straight. And when she reached out and pressed her palm flat against the wood, the whole panel gave, just slightly, and moved. Every instinct she had told her not to tear into a dead man's wall in the dark on her first morning in his house. The panel had moved, and that was enough to know it would move again. Whatever waited behind it had waited since spring. It could wait until she had good light and the right tool and a steadier heart. She stood up. Barrow had gone quiet the moment she touched the wood, like he had said his piece and could finally rest. He watched her climb the stone steps and he followed her up, close at her heel now, no longer wild but not yet tame. A creature deciding whether to believe in her. Back in the main room, the fire had burned down. Nadine fed it, put water on to heat, and cut 2 thick slices from the loaf she had brought. One she ate standing at the window while the light came up gray and then gold over the ridge. The other she set on the floor by the door. The dog looked at the bread, then at her. "Go on," she said. "It's yours." He ate like a starving thing, fast and low, keeping one eye on her the whole time. When he finished, he did not leave. He lay down across the threshold with his back to the fire and his face to the yard, and Nadine understood she had been assigned a guard whether she wanted one or not. She spent that first full day learning the house. The roof leaked in the back corner, just as she had been warned, and a brown bloom on the ceiling boards proved it. The well still drew water, cold and iron-tasting, but clean. The wood stove pulled fine once she cleaned the soot from the pipe. There was a lifetime of small competence in these rooms. Shelves squared and level, joints cut tight, a boot jack worn smooth by one man's heel. The more she looked, the more she felt she was moving through the workshop of someone careful and solitary and quietly skilled. By the second evening, she had the leak stopped with a scrap of tin and a bucket of tar from the shed, and her hands were black to the wrist, and Barrow had crept close enough to the stove that his tail lay across her boot. She did not reach for him. A frightened thing comes to you in its own time or not at all, and she had nursed enough of them, the 2-legged kind and the 4, to know the difference. She let her boot stay where it was and kept her breathing slow, and after a while he sighed and put his chin down on her foot, and that was the beginning of it. "You knew him," she said to the dog that night, more to hear a voice in the house than anything. "You knew him better than the whole town did, I expect." Barrow thumped his tail once against the floorboards and did not lift his head, and she took it for an answer. She needed proper supplies before she could touch the cellar, so the next morning she walked the 4 miles down to town. Barrow went with her to the head of the ridge road, then stopped where the gravel began, and no amount of coaxing would carry him further. He sat down in the road and watched her go, and he was still sitting there when she came back that afternoon. The town was a slow place, and word of the woman who bought the Bly place had already gone through it. She felt it in the hardware store, where the young man at the register rang up her pry bar and box of nails and hasp, without a word, but kept sneaking looks at her, and in the pair of old men on the bench out front who went quiet when she passed. She bought a sack of proper dog food, a bag of apples, cornmeal, coffee, and lamp oil, spending money she was frightened to spend, and doing the arithmetic in her head the whole time. Then she carried it all down the block to the diner, because her feet hurt and because Odessa had told her to come back. "You lived," Odessa said, sliding a plate of eggs in front of her before she had fully sat. "I half expected to hear you turned around for the city. I'm not much for turning around." "No." Odessa poured coffee for them both and settled onto the next stool, which meant the diner was empty and the talking could begin. "So, how's the Bly place treating you?" Nadine told her about the roof and the well and the good tight joints. She did not mention the wall in the cellar, and she could not have said exactly why, except that it felt like hers now, a thing she wanted to understand before she handed it to anyone else. "There's a dog," she said instead. "Big shepherd, half wild. Been living up there. Won't leave." Odessa set her cup down. She went quiet, and her broad face softened in a way Nadine had not seen on it. "That'd be Barrow," she said. "Emmett's dog, we all figured he was dead. He'd have been up there alone the better part of a year, through the whole winter." She shook her head slowly. "That old dog waited 9 months on a ridge for a man who was never coming back down. And now he's decided you'll do." She looked at Nadine, and there was wonder in it. "Animals know things, honey. I've lived long enough to quit arguing with what they know. You said he was the undertaker, Emmett." Nadine turned her cup. "Everybody says his name like they're stepping around it. Tell me about the man." Odessa refilled cups that did not need it, a thing her hands did while her mind worked. "He buried my husband," she said finally. "Years back now. Times were tight, and I told him I'd pay him over the year. And he took my hand and told me the county had covered it, so there was nothing owed. I found out a long time later the county covered no such thing. He'd paid it himself and lied straight to my face so I wouldn't feel the weight of owing him." She was quiet a moment. "I never got to thank him proper because he wouldn't stand still long enough to let me. That was Emmett. Do a kindness and be gone before you could turn it into a debt. That's not a man to be afraid of. No, that's the sorrow of it." Odessa wrapped both hands around her cup. "Folks made him into a story because he never let a single soul close enough to know better. Never married. Never came to church. Never sat in here and passed an hour like a regular person. He had a nephew somewhere off, his sister's boy, Garrett, but I don't believe that man came up here twice in all those years. So the old man died alone in that house and lay there the better part of 2 weeks before the mail carrier thought to check. And that is the piece that turned the place unlucky in people's heads. A man dying where nobody hears. It scares them. So they call it a curse, and they stay off the ridge. And not one of them ever stops to wonder if maybe he was just lonely. Nadine turned the wren over in her coat pocket without drawing it out, a habit of her fingers whenever a thing sat heavy on her. There is nothing in a house like that, she said, but somebody who was loved less than he should have been. I've sat with plenty of them at the end. It's the ones the world forgot who go the hardest, because they spend their last hours wondering if any of it counted for anything. Odessa looked at her a long moment. You, she said, are going to be good for this town, whether it deserves you or not. Then the bell over the door rang, and 2 loggers came in, stamping the cold off their boots, and the talking was done for the day. Nadine walked the 4-mile home with a full pack and a fuller mind. Barrow was waiting at the head of the gravel where she had left him, and this time, when she said his name, the name Odessa had given back to her. His ears came up and his whole body changed. He had not heard it in 9 months. He fell in at her side and walked her all the way to the porch, and that night he came inside and lay by the stove, and she did not have the heart to put him out in the cold. She worked on the house 3 more days before she let herself go back down into the cellar. She told herself it was practical, that a dry roof mattered more than a mystery, and there was truth in that. But there was fear too. The plain human fear of what a solitary man might seal up in a wall, and she wanted the place to feel like hers before she found out. Every evening, Barrow went and stood at the cellar door and looked back at her, and every evening she told him not yet, and he lay down again and waited, because waiting was the thing he did best. On the 4th day, the roof was patched, the front door had its new hasp, and there was nothing left but the thing she had been circling. She carried the lamp and the pry bar down the stone steps, and Barrow came with her, calm now, and sat at the bottom of the stairs to watch. The panel of newer boards waited in the corner. She fit the flat end of the bar behind the seam and leaned her weight into it, and the old nails gave with a long groaning shriek, and the whole section swung free. Behind it was not dirt. Behind it was a room. It was small, maybe 6 feet by 8, dug back into the hillside and lined with the same careful stone as the foundation, dry as a bone and cold. Her lamp filled it with yellow light, and Nadine stood in the low doorway and did not breathe for a moment, because it was the most ordered, most cared-for space she had ever stepped into, and it had belonged to the man the whole county thought was strange. Shelves ran along both side walls, built plumb and true, and they were full. Ledgers stood in rows, dozens of them, cloth-bound and numbered on the spine in a small block hand. Bundles of letters were tied with string and stacked by year. A squat iron strongbox sat on the floor under the bench, with a heavy padlock on the hasp, and against the back wall stood a workbench, and on the bench, in the exact spot where the light pooled brightest, sat a shallow tray, and the tray was full of birds. Wrens. Small carved wrens, some finished and smooth, some rough from the knife, some no more than a block with a beak started at one end. There were dozens of them, a whole flock in every stage of becoming, and a set of carving tools laid out beside them in an oiled cloth roll, each blade seated in its place. Nadine set the lamp on the bench with a hand gone unsteady, and she made herself think like a nurse instead of a frightened woman, one fact at a time. She lifted down the nearest ledger and opened it. The pages were columns. A date, the name of a place, never a person, only places. The low road, the Hutchins farm, the church at the crossing, the trailer down by the creek. An amount, small sums mostly, a few dollars, a load of wood, a month of somebody's electric. And beside each entry, drawn in ink no bigger than a fingernail, a tiny wren. She turned the pages. 1988, 1989, winter after winter, entry after entry, the same small hand, the same small bird, a widow's heating oil, a child's medicine, a funeral, and beside it the single word paid, and the little wren. There were hundreds of them in that one book alone. On the shelves stood 20 more like it, 3 decades of a man giving away money in the dark and signing his name with a bird so not one living soul would know it was him. She ran a finger down a column and did the arithmetic without meaning to, the nurse in her adding up a life. A cord of wood here, a doctor's bill there, somebody's rent for the month the mill closed and half the valley went hungry. Small sums, every one of them, money that does not change a life so much as keep it from ending. There was more kindness recorded in that one cold room than she had seen in most churches. She thought of the tin cup on the table upstairs with its ring of dried coffee, the coat worn thin at the elbows, the single plate and single fork of a man who never once expected company, and she understood that he had spent himself down to almost nothing so that other people would not have to. She understood, too, what Odessa had almost told her without knowing it, The town had built a story about a cold, strange man who kept to himself, and the story had it exactly backward. Emmett Bly had not been hiding from the county, he had been hiding what he did for it. Among the tied bundles on the shelf, one envelope stood apart, propped upright where a person would see it first. Across the front, in the same careful block letters she would have known anywhere, it read, "To whoever finds this." She reached for it and then stopped, because her hand was shaking too hard to trust it, and because there are letters you do not open standing up. Her legs found the stool at the bench, and she sat down hard. Barrow rose from the stairs, came to her, and leaned his weight against her knee, and she rested her hand on his rough head without looking down, because she could not look away from the tray of birds. Slowly, she reached out and lifted one. A finished wren, pale amber wood, head tipped, tail cocked. It sat in her palm with a weight she knew before she felt it, a weight her hand had carried for 34 winters. She had picked it up, half afraid it would burn her. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her own. She set them side by side on the workbench under the lamp, the one she had carried since the worst winter of her life, and the one she had lifted from a dead man's tray, and there was no mistaking it and no explaining it away. The same wood, the same cuts, the same tipped head, the same cocked tail, made by the same knife in the same hand. For a long time she did not move. Two identical birds lay on the workbench under the lamp, and the whole shape of her life bent slowly around them like a road she had walked 1,000 times, suddenly showing her a turn she had never seen. The man who carved the wren in her pocket had lived on this ridge. She was sitting in his chair. She had bought his house for $280 because it was the only thing on earth she could afford, and it had turned out to be the one place that already knew her name. She needed to understand it, and there was only one thing left in that room that might tell her how. She rose and took down the envelope propped apart from the others, the one that said, "To whoever finds this," and she carried it up the stone steps into the light of the main room, and sat at the plank table where Emmett Bly had taken his coffee alone for most of his life. Barrow lay down against her feet. She worked the flap open with a thumbnail and unfolded 2 pages covered in that small block hand. "Whoever you are," it began, "you have found the back of the cellar, and that means you have found the birds, and by now you have likely guessed the rest. I was the undertaker in this county for 40 years. I buried the rich and I buried the poor, and I learned early that the poor die the same as anybody, only they die owing, and their families spend the grief they should be spending on love worrying about a bill instead. The first time I paid for a burial out of my own pocket, I was 31 years old, and I told myself it was the only time. It was not the only time. Once you have seen how little it takes to lift a weight off a broken person, you cannot stop. I never once signed my name. A name turns a gift into a debt, and I never wanted a single soul on this earth to owe me. A carved bird owes nobody anything. I made a wren because it is the smallest voice in the woods, and still the first one you hear at dawn. And that seemed to me the right size for a kindness. Small, early, gone before you are properly awake. There is money in the box under the bench. It is not a fortune, but it is enough to keep the birds flying a good while yet. The key is behind the 3rd stone up from the floor, on the left. There is a list in the last ledger of the people I meant to reach, and did not, because a man runs out of winters faster than he runs out of neighbors. I am not asking you to take this up. It is a heavy thing and you did not choose it. But if you are the sort who found the back of a cellar and then sat down to read a dead man's mail instead of counting his silverware, maybe you are the sort who will. If you are not, then burn the ledgers so no shame ever comes back on the families written in them. Keep the money, and think of me kindly. Either way, the house is yours now, and so is the quiet. I hope it treats you better than the county ever did." It was signed, the way everything he had ever given away was signed, with a small drawn wren. Nadine read it twice. Then she went back down into the cellar, counted 3 stones up from the floor on the left, and worked the loose one free. And behind it lay a brass key on a loop of wire. The strongbox opened with a click that sounded loud in that buried room. Inside was money, banded in worn paper, more than she had held in her hands since the day she sold her mother's ring, and less than a person would kill for. Beneath it lay a folded paper naming the fund plainly as a thing set apart, kept out of any estate, belonging to the house and to the work, and to no heir at all. And under that lay the last ledger, open to a page only half filled, the most recent dates running right up to the week before he died. The unfinished list. She read it by lamplight, with Barrow's chin on her boot. A family out past the crossing, roof gone through, 2 children, the old man on the county road whose oxygen ran on electricity he could no longer pay for, and near the bottom, in a hand grown shakier than the early pages, a line that stopped her cold. The girl who waits tables for Odessa. Heat shut off. Baby coming. See to it before winter. He had run out of winter. She sat with all of it a long while. Then she did what she had done her whole life when a thing was too big to feel. She got up and put the kettle on and gave herself a task, because a woman with a task is a woman who has not yet drowned. The next morning, she walked down to the diner, and she was careful because she had decided something on the long walk down, and she did not want her face giving it away. Odessa poured the coffee. Nadine let the room empty, and then she asked the question as lightly as she could manage. Odessa, in all your years here, did anybody ever do things for people? Quiet things and leave a little carved bird behind so nobody would ever know who? Odessa stopped wiping the counter. Her whole face changed, opened, went young for a second under the gray hair. The wren, she said, and there was love in the word. You've been here 2 weeks, and you already caught wind of the wren. She laughed, delighted. Honey, everybody in 3 towns has a wren story. My cousin's electric got paid the same month her husband walked out on her, and there was a little woodbird sitting in the mailbox. The Hutchins girl needed a surgery nobody in that family could ever have paid for, and the hospital called and said an anonymous friend had covered the whole of it, and a bird turned up on their porch rail that afternoon. A man over the mountain lost his boy to the river and couldn't afford to bury him, and it got seen to, and a bird was waiting on the fresh grave the morning of the funeral. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand and kept on, because once a person starts telling the wren, they do not want to stop. It went on for 30 years. Firewood stacked in the night, an envelope of cash left on a bad step at a hard month. Always the bird, never a name, never a knock on the door. We used to argue about it right here at this counter. Some said it was a church too proud to take credit. Some said a rich man buying off his conscience. My own mother swore up and down it was an angel, and she was not a woman given to foolishness. Nobody ever once found out. Her voice dropped. Whoever it was held this whole county together through some terrible winters and never asked for so much as a thank you. That's how it works up here, honey. Nobody asks who left the wood on the porch. You just make sure the fire's lit for whoever comes next. That is the closest thing to God I ever personally laid eyes on. Nadine held her coffee in both hands so they would not shake. She understood the whole of it now. The town had spent a generation loving a stranger it never once knew was the strange old man it was afraid of. They had made him a curse, and he had made them a legend. And only one of those 2 things had ever been true. Did it stop? Nadine asked. The wren. Odessa's face fell a little. Come to think of it, last spring. She said it slowly, hearing herself. Haven't heard a fresh wren story since about last spring. She did not make the connection. Why would she? The strange old undertaker who died alone on the unlucky ridge, and the angel who had held the county together all that time, were not 2 people you would ever set side by side. Guess even angels get tired, Odessa said, and Nadine let her believe it because it was not her secret to spend. She walked home the 4 miles and told no one. Then that evening she took the ledgers down one at a time and went looking for herself, and it did not take her nearly as long as she feared. She knew the year. She knew the season. She found it in the 3rd book, on a page gone brittle at the edges, 34 winters back. The young widow in the rented rooms behind the mill, it read. Husband lost at the quarry. Baby boy. Funeral scene 2. Coal in a winter's wood. And beside it, drawn small and sure, the word she had waited half her life to have answered. The answer that had ridden in her coat pocket in the shape of a bird ever since. A tiny inked wren. She sat very still. The memory came up on her before she could stop it the morning the envelope appeared on the step, though she had not let herself think of it in years. She had stood on that frozen porch with the baby coughing against her shoulder, looking up the empty road and down the empty road, and seeing not one living soul. And she had thought that whoever left it must have had wings, because no ordinary person could come and go on new snow and leave no tracks. Now she knew the truth of it. It had been no angel and no ordinary man. It had been an undertaker, a man who had spent his whole life learning how to move quiet at the edge of other people's worst mornings and never be seen. He had stood just out of her sight and let her keep her pride, and then he had gone home to this ridge and carved another bird. The stranger who had kept her baby alive and the man whose roof she had been sleeping under were the same person. She had run from her son all the way back to the county she came from, and she had walked without knowing it straight into the house of the one man who once decided a broke young widow and her infant were worth saving. She had come home without ever knowing she had been here before. If you have made it this far into Nadine's story, do me one small kindness and hit that subscribe button, because what she did next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. She did not weep over the ledger, though she had earned the right. She closed the book gently, the way she used to close the eyes of the dead, and she made her decision as she had made every hard decision in her life, without drama and without going back on it. The old man had spent his last strength worrying about a girl who waited tables and could not pay her heat. He had run out of winter before he could see to it. Nadine had not. She counted out enough from the box to clear a heating account and carry it clean through spring. And she took one finished wren from the tray, and the next morning she rode into town with the man who hauled propane and asked to be let off at the little brick utility office. She stood in line behind a farmer paying his own bill and a woman disputing hers. And when it was her turn, she paid the girl's account in full, in cash. She gave the name at the window and nothing else. And who should I say took care of it? The clerk asked. Pen ready, because that was the form and the form had a line for it. A friend, Nadine said. She set the small carved bird on the counter between them. See, that gets to her with the receipt. No name on it? Just that. The clerk looked at the bird, and looked at the old woman in the good wool coat, and she started to say something more, but Nadine was already out the door and halfway down the block before the woman could turn her kindness into a debt. She thought that was the end of it, quiet and clean. She did not yet understand that a small county has long ears, and that a stranger down from the unlucky ridge paying another stranger's bill in cash and leaving a wooden bird was in that little office the single most interesting thing to happen in a year. Before the propane truck had finished its route, the story was already moving. The old woman who bought the Bly place had money. Real money, cash money, enough to throw at other people's bills. And where would a woman like that come by money, unless it had been up on that ridge the whole time? Unless the tight-fisted old undertaker who never spent a dime on himself had been sitting on a pile of it, and the county had let the whole thing go for $280 in back taxes. The story took 9 days to climb the family tree and reach a man 200 miles away who had always believed his uncle owed him something. It reached Garrett Kell on a Thursday. By the following Monday, he had spoken to a lawyer. Nadine knew none of this. Her days had found a shape she had not felt in years. She fixed the house in the mornings and read the ledgers in the evenings, learning the whole county through the record of its hardest nights, and Barrow followed her from room to room as though he had signed on for the entire enterprise. She had begun, quietly, to plan. There were names still waiting on the unfinished list. There was a winter coming. She had a house, a dog, a box of money that was not hers to keep, but hers to spend rightly, and for the first time since a Tuesday in November, she woke each morning with a reason to. It was late on an ordinary afternoon, the light going long and gold across the yard, when Barrow lifted his head off the floor and growled, low, at the sound of an engine climbing the ridge road. Nadine stepped out onto the porch, wiping tar from her hands, and watched a car she did not know come up through the trees and stop in the yard, and a man in a pressed shirt get out with a certified envelope in one hand and a practiced apology already arranged on his face. She had just taken the envelope, still not knowing its weight, when a second engine sounded on the road below. One she did know, one she had listened to back out of a driveway in another life. A truck came around the last bend into the clearing, and her son climbed down from it, and Wesley had heard, 400 miles away, that his mother had come into money. He looked older than he had in November, and smaller, and he stood in the yard with his hands pushed into his jacket and could not seem to find her eyes. The lawyer's man took one look at the family reunion assembling in that clearing, said his piece about the certified notice, and was gone down the ridge road inside 2 minutes. Glad to be out of it. Ma, Wesley said, you look good. The place looks. It's really something, what you've done with it. You drove 400 miles to tell me the porch looks nice. He winced. Barrow had come out to stand at her hip, watching Wesley with the flat, still attention of an animal reading a stranger, and Wesley kept glancing down at him. Can we go inside? Can we sit down? I've been driving since 4 this morning. She fed him first, because she was his mother and a lifetime of feeding him did not switch off because he had wronged her. She put a plate in front of him at the plank table and let him eat, and she watched him take in the room, the squared shelves, the wood stove, the small evidences of a solvent life, and she watched him do the arithmetic he had come to do. People are saying you came into money, he said at last, setting his fork down. Up here, that the old man who had this place left something behind. He tried to make it sound like concern. I got worried. A woman your age, out here alone, word gets around you've got cash. That's dangerous. I came to make sure you were safe. That's part of it. He rubbed his face with both hands, and when he brought them down, the pretense came down with them, because he had never been able to hold a lie in front of her for long. I'm in trouble, Ma. Real trouble. The kind you don't climb out of. The business, the second mortgage, that was just the start of it. I borrowed to cover the borrowing. There's a man now, not a bank, a man, and the number he wants by spring is more than I could earn back if I worked till I died. And he is not the type you explain yourself to. His voice cracked. The house was supposed to fix it. It didn't. It just bought me a few months. And now I hear my mother's sitting on a pile of cash up a mountain. And God help me, I thought maybe it was a way out. The whole ugly shape of it sat out in the open between them at last. Nadine looked at her son, at the gray coming into his hair, at the fear in him that was real even if everything around it was rotten, and she felt the grief of it settle into her like cold into a joint. But the old reflex did not come, the one he was counting on, the one that had spent her whole life fixing him at any cost to herself. "I want to tell you a story," she said, "and I want you to sit there and hear all of it before you say one word." She told him. She told him about a young widow in rented rooms behind the mill with a baby and $40 and a husband to bury, and no way to do it. Then she told him about the envelope on the step with no name, the $300, the note that said for the baby in the winter, and the small carved bird that came wrapped in the same paper. She took the wren out of her coat pocket and set it on the table between the salt in his coffee cup. "That baby was you," she said. "That widow was me. Somebody I never met paid to bury your father, and bought the coal that kept you breathing through the winter you were 7 months old. And he signed it with this bird, and I have carried it every day of my life since, and never once knew who to thank." She let it sit. "I know now. His name was Emmett Bly. This was his house. That box of money you drove 400 miles to get your hands on is the very same money that once kept you alive. You are sitting in the kitchen of the man who saved your life before you could walk, trying to take what's left of him to pay a loan shark." Wesley was staring at the bird. His mouth opened and closed. "Ma," he said, "I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know." "No, you didn't. That's rather the whole trouble with you, son. You never once asked where any of it came from." She reached across and covered the wren with her hand. "This money is not mine, and it was never yours. It was lent to this county by a man who asked nobody for a thing, and I mean to pay it back the way he would have wanted, one dark winter at a time, to the next family sitting where I once sat. Not into a hole you dug for yourself. I am sorry about the man you owe. I am not sorry enough to feed him what saved you. So that's it. Your own son drowning, and you'll spend it on strangers." For a moment, he did not move. "You'd really let him take me down," he said, "to keep faith with a dead man you never even met." "I'm keeping faith with the woman I was at 26, she said. "And the baby she carried, and every stranger in those books who got to go on living because somebody they never met decided they were worth it. You're asking me to burn all of that to buy you one more year of running. I won't do it." She softened, but she did not bend. "I'm not giving you money, Wesley. I'm giving you a reason to be the man I raised you to be. There is honest work up here, and a bed and a table, and a mother who will not put you out no matter what a court says about who holds the deed. That door stays open. The box does not. If what you came for is the box, then you already have your answer, and you can drive back down the way you came." It was the kindest thing she had ever refused him, and he heard only the refusal. He stood so fast the chair barked against the floor, and Barrow was on his feet in the same instant, low and silent, and Wesley looked at the dog and then at his mother, and there was such a wildness of shame and fury in his face that she almost went to him. But she held still, and he grabbed his jacket and went out and slammed the truck door and ground the engine, and he was gone down the ridge in a spray of gravel, and the quiet came back over the clearing like water closing over a dropped stone. She sat a while with her hand on Barrow's head. Then she picked up the certified letter, because grief could wait and the law could not. It was from Garrett Kell's attorney, and it said, "In the long cold way those letters say things, that the sale of the property was being contested, that Mr. Kell, as sole surviving blood relative, asserted a claim to the estate of Emmett Bly and to any and all assets on the property, and that Nadine was to preserve everything and remove nothing." She read it twice, and the old fear came up in her. The fear of a poor woman who has learned that the law is a tool the moneyed used to take things from people who cannot fight back. But she was not that young widow anymore. She was 71 years old, and she had buried strangers and raised a son alone, and lost a house and bought another with the last of her money. And she had run clean out of things to be afraid of. So she went to town. Odessa listened to the whole of it over a cold cup of coffee. The eviction and the ledgers and the birds and the letter. And somewhere in the telling her face went from soft to fierce. "Show me," Odessa said. "Show me a bird." Nadine set a wren on the counter. Odessa picked it up with 2 fingers, and her eyes filled, and her hand closed around it. "It was him," she whispered. "All these years. It was Emmett, the man we let die alone up there." She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. "We made him a curse, Nadine. This whole town turned that gentleman into a ghost story because he was too shy to let us love him back. He didn't want anybody to know. He wrote it down plain. He never wanted a soul to owe him. But he's past owing now. The dead can't be held in anybody's debt. And there is a man with a lawyer trying to take his house and pour what's left of a lifetime of kindness into his own pocket. And I don't think Emmett gets to stay a secret anymore. Not if the secret is the thing that loses all of it." They did not decide it lightly, the 2 of them, because it was the old man's one wish they were about to spend. But they decided it. Odessa knew every family in 3 towns, knew which ones kept a wren story folded away like a pressed flower, and she went and told them, one porch at a time, that the wren had been found, that it had been Emmett Bly all along, the undertaker, the strange old man on the unlucky ridge, and that a stranger who had taken up his work was about to lose everything to a nephew who never came to visit. A county that will drive past a curse will walk a long way for a saint. Within the week, Nadine's yard had seen more visitors than the old man's had in a decade. They came up the ridge road with casseroles she did not need, and stories she did, 100 small accounts of a bird on a rail and a bill mysteriously settled. A big man in a feed store cap stood twisting the cap in his hands on her new porch and could barely get the words out. My girl had a hole in her heart, he said. 1996. The hospital wanted more than my house was worth. And one morning they called and said an anonymous friend had covered the whole of it, and there was a little wood bird on my truck seat that I never could explain. He looked out at the ridge, his jaw working. She's got 2 babies of her own now. I drove up here to tell you I'll stand in this yard with a shotgun before I let some nephew from off take $1 of that man's away from what he built it for. Nobody's going to need a shotgun, Nadine told him gently. But you can tell your girl who it was now. He'd have hated that. Tell her anyway. The retired judge came too, a man who had buried his wife on the old man's dime, and he stood in the yard and told Nadine, quietly, that no court in the county would strip a tax-clean sale to enrich an absentee heir, that the fund the old man had set apart in writing was a charitable trust and everything but the fancy paperwork, and that Garrett's lawyer knew it as well as he did. Let him come, the judge said. Let him stand in front of people who knew what his uncle was. He won't file a thing. By the end of that week, there was firewood stacked by her shed that she had not cut, and a ham on the porch rail with no note, and Odessa had closed the diner for an afternoon and driven up the ridge to sit on the new porch and say what the rest of the town was too slow to say out loud. We owe him, Odessa said, looking out at the pines. And we can't pay him now, God rest him. So we'll pay you, and you'll pay it on down the line. And that's how a debt this size gets carried. Nadine said that was exactly how the old man would have wanted it. And the 2 women sat a while and did not need to say anything more. Garrett Kell came himself in the end. He drove up the ridge on a gray afternoon expecting, she thought, to find a con woman squatting on his uncle's hoard. What he found was a plain old woman on a mended porch and a county closed around her like a fist. He was a tired man of 50, with his uncle's long face and none of his uncle's peace, and he stood in the yard with his hands in his pockets and his grievance loaded and ready. He cut my mother off. His own sister, Garrett said, never gave us a dime all those years, and the whole family knew he had it, money he could have shared with his own blood, and he'd rather sit up here alone and count it. So forgive me if I don't believe the old miser suddenly turned generous the one time it wasn't for family. Nadine did not argue with him. She took him down into the cellar instead. She put the lamp in his hand and let him stand in that ordered little room and read the spines of a lifetime of ledgers. And she watched the anger go out of him page by page as he understood what his uncle had actually done with the money he had resented all his life. He gave it all away, Garrett said. He sounded like a man who had been robbed. He let us think he was cold. He let me hate him half my life, and the whole time he was up here paying for other people's funerals in the dark. He picked up a half-carved wren, turned it in his fingers, and his face broke, finally, grief and shame arriving together with nowhere to put either. Why wouldn't he just tell one person? Just me. I'd have come. Because a name turns a gift into a debt, Nadine said gently, and he never wanted anyone to owe him, not even you. Especially not you. He'd rather you thought him hard than have you feel you owed him your whole life. Garrett set the little bird down with a care that did not match his anger. He stood in his uncle's cellar a long moment, and then he told her he would call his lawyer in the morning and end it. That he wanted no part of the money. That his only regret was that no one had let him know the old man for who he really was, while there was still time to say he was sorry. Before he left, he asked if he might keep one wren. She let him take the one he was holding. That night, Nadine sat on the porch with Barrow while the whole valley went blue below her, and she felt the strange arithmetic of her life come out even at last. She had lost a house and found a purpose. She had lost a son to his own fear and found a county full of people who would stand in her yard. The box in the cellar would never make her rich, and she found she did not want it to. She wanted only to spend it the way it had been spent on her, quietly, before anybody was properly awake. She thought of the unfinished list waiting in the last ledger, the girl at the diner, the family on the county road with the dead furnace, all the names the old man had run out of winter before he could reach. She would reach them. She had the time he no longer had, and a purpose she had waited her whole life for without knowing it, and a whole county at her back that had finally remembered how to love the one who kept it warm. You were never truly poor, she thought, while you still have something worth giving away, and she understood at last that the old man had not left her money at all. He had left her a way to be rich, She did not hear the footsteps on the ridge road until Barrow's head came up. It was full dark, and there were no headlights because the truck was parked a mile down where the gas had finally run out. And the man coming up the road on foot, with his collar turned against the cold, had nowhere left in the whole world to go but back to his mother's door. Nadine opened the door before he could knock. Wesley stood on the mended porch in the dark with his collar up and his hands empty. No truck behind him, no scheme left in him. Just a middle-aged man who had run out of road and gas and lies on the same night. He did not ask to come in. He just stood there and let her see him, which was the first honest thing he had done in years. "The man I owe," he said. His voice was raw. "I'm going to the police in the morning, not for the money, because I'd rather owe the law than owe him, and because I'm done being the kind of man who takes from his own mother." He swallowed. "I don't want the box, Ma. I never should have come here for it. I came back to tell you that, and then I'll go, if you want me to go." Nadine looked at her son for a long moment. Forgiveness is not a feeling. It is a door you decide to leave open even after you have every right to close it. She stepped back and held the door wide. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "The fire's lit." He came in. Barrow watched him the whole way, then sighed and put his head back down, and that plain animal permission seemed to undo Wesley completely. He sat at the table where the wren still lay by the salt and put his face in his hands. "I keep thinking about the funeral," he said after a while, not lifting his head. "Dad's. I don't remember any of it. I was a baby, but you carried that alone, all of it. And I never once asked you how. I never asked you anything in my life. I just took." He looked up, and his eyes were wet. "How do you sit there and feed me, after what I did?" Nadine set a mug of coffee in front of him. "Because a long time ago, somebody fed me when I'd done nothing to earn it either," she said. "You don't earn a plate of supper, Wesley. Somebody hands it to you, and someday you hand one to the next person. That's the whole trick of being a human being. Your grandfather never learned it, and it turned him mean. I would hate to watch it turn one of you." He wrapped his hands around the mug like a man warming them at the last fire on earth. "I don't know how to be anything but what I've been." "Then you'll learn it slow," she said. "The same as I did. Eat." He ate. Neither of them said very much after that, and it was enough. He went to the county sheriff 2 days later and told the truth about the man and the loan. All of it. And it was ugly and slow, and it did not resolve like it would in a story. There were statements, and there were lawyers, and there was a long, unglamorous winter of him earning almost nothing and paying back what he honestly could, and sleeping in the back room of a house that legally belonged to a woman he had once thrown out of a house. He did not become a good man overnight. He became a man trying, which is the only good kind there is, and he learned that the whole distance between the two is just showing up again the next morning. There was a night in February he nearly ran. Nadine woke to the sound of the truck door and found him sitting behind the wheel in the cold, not starting it, only gripping it. She put her coat on over her nightgown and went out and climbed into the seat beside him and said nothing for a while. "They'll always want more than I've got," he said finally. "I could drive somewhere, nobody knows my name, and start clean." "You could. Men do it every day," she said. "And they spend what's left of their lives being nobody, because a man who runs packs the running and takes it with him." She laid her hand over his on the wheel. "Or you stay up this cold mountain with an old woman and a dog and do the hard, boring, honest thing, and give it a few years and you're a man your own children could point to. I can't choose it for you, but I know which road your father's people would have run to, and I know which one Emmett Bly would have stayed for." He sat there a long time with the wind moving the pines. Then he pulled the key out of the ignition and put it in her hand, and they went back inside, and he did not speak of leaving again. As winter loosened into spring, the ridge changed. Wesley tore the sag out of the porch and rebuilt it square, and it was the first thing he had made with his hands in longer than he could remember that nobody paid him for. Nadine turned the old beaten dog track in the yard into rows and put in beans and greens and potatoes. Barrow grew fat and easy and slept in the sun. The corner that had leaked her first gray morning was a dry patch of new boards now, and the house smelled of cedar and coffee and turned earth instead of cold ash, and anyone passing on the ridge road would have called it a home and never once guessed it had been a curse. The girl from the diner came in April. Her name was Wren, which Nadine took privately as the old man having a last laugh from wherever he had got to. She was hardly 22, with a baby on her hip and a rattling hatchback and a heating account that had been paid current clear through the spring by a friend who left a wooden bird at the utility window. She had asked everyone in town who the friend was, and at last somebody told her to try the Bly place. "I don't need to know who it was," Wren said, standing in the yard with her little girl gone shy behind her leg. "Odessa said up here you don't ask who left the wood on the porch. But I couldn't just take it and say nothing. I had to say it to somebody's face." Her chin trembled. "You saved us. Whoever did it, That heat was the only thing between my daughter and me and going back to a place I swore I'd never go back to. So, thank you. That's all I came to say. Nadine looked at the girl and the baby, and she saw a young widow in rented rooms behind a mill, with $40 and no way out, and she understood that the wheel had come all the way around and she was standing now on the side of it the old man had stood on. She did not confess. She crouched down instead to the little girl's level and held out one weathered hand. "You like dogs?" she said. It was not a question. The child looked at Barrow, who had come to sit with his big patient head level with hers, and after a moment she put her small hand flat on his nose, and the dog closed his eyes and let her, and the girl laughed, and that laugh did more for the house than a year of hammering had. "You'll stay for supper," Nadine told the mother. And it was not a question either, and the girl stayed for supper, and then she stayed for the summer, and by the time the leaves turned, she and the little one had the back room. It was the small, tight room off the kitchen Nadine had wondered about her first week. The one with the low extra bed and the window that caught the morning sun. The room a solitary old man had built onto his house for no reason anyone could name, unless some part of him had always known a house like his would one day need to take somebody in. Nadine learned to carve. She was clumsy at it a long while and ruined a dozen good blocks of basswood before her hands found the trick. But the old man's tools were patient, and his half-finished birds were a lesson she could hold, and by fall she could turn out a wren that would have passed on his own tray. She was 72 by then. A person is never too old to learn a dead man's trade, especially when the trade is kindness. By the second winter, she had taught the girl too. Wren's first birds came out rough as Nadine's had, but her hands were young and quick, and soon she could carve one in an evening at the kitchen table with the little one asleep against her shoulder. "Why a bird?" Wren asked one night, turning a finished wren under the lamp. "Why not just put your name on the envelope so people know somebody good's out there?" "Because a name turns a gift into a debt," Nadine said, "and the whole point is to hand somebody something they can never pay back and never feel they have to." The girl was quiet, working it through. "So they just get to be warm," she said slowly, "and they never have to feel small about it." "That's the whole of it," Nadine said. "You understand it better already than the whole county managed in all its years of guessing." Wren nodded and bent back to her knife, and Nadine watched her young hands make the old man's shape, and she thought that the work would outlast the both of them now, which was the only kind of forever she had ever managed to believe in. The town tended his grave now. It had lain neglected at the edge of the churchyard under a marker so plain you would walk past it, and Nadine had found it that way in May and stood over it a good while. Somebody had already left a small carved bird on the stone. By June, there were a dozen. By late summer, the grass was cut and there were flowers, and the retired judge had quietly seen to a real headstone, and on it, beneath the name and the dates, at the county's own insistence, someone had cut a single wren. She took Wesley there in the fall. He had never met the man whose house he slept in and whose money he had driven 400 miles to steal, and he stood over the stone a long time with his hands in his pockets, the way his mother stood, the way the dead man's own nephew had once stood. "He paid for my father's funeral," Wesley said finally. "He kept me alive before I could walk, and I came up here to rob what was left of him." He crouched and set his palm flat on the cold granite. "I don't know how a man makes a thing like that right." "You don't make it right," Nadine said. "You make it forward. That's the only direction it runs." She put her hand on her son's shoulder. "He would have told you the same. Do a kindness and be gone before anybody can turn it into a debt." That was the whole of his religion, and it turned out to be mine, and now it's turning out to be yours. I just took a lifetime to find out where I first learned it. That winter, the first hard freeze came early and caught a family out on the county road with a dead furnace and no money to fix it. A young couple with 3 children and a 4th on the way, exactly the sort of name the old man would have written in his book. Nadine wrote it in hers. She counted out what it would take from the box in the cellar, wrapped it with a wren she had carved with her own hands, and she did not go alone. Wesley carried the wood. He hauled it off the truck in the dark and stacked it high and dry against the family's porch, while his mother left the envelope and the bird where they would be found at dawn. And the two of them worked without a word, and no light came on in the house, and no one ever knew they had been there. On the way home, Wesley said his back ached and his hands were froze, and he could not remember the last time he had felt this good. And Nadine laughed in the dark of the truck cab and told him that was the secret nobody believed until they had done it. That giving something away when you barely have enough yourself is the nearest a person ever comes to feeling full. Near Christmas, a package reached the ridge with no return address. Inside was a check made out to no name at all, only to the work, and a single carved wren, clumsy, plainly a first attempt by hands not used to a knife. There was no note, and there did not need to be one. Garrett Kell had gone home and taken up his uncle's trade after all. And somewhere, 200 miles off, a stranger was going to be warned that winter, and never know why. Nadine set his crooked little bird on the workbench beside the others and left it there. And it was, she thought, the best of the flock. They never told the family on the county road. That was the point. Around the county, the wren stories started up again after a year of silence. A bird on a rail, a bill somehow paid, and the people who told them did not know and did not need to know that the wren was 3 people now and a dog, an old woman and her son, and a girl with a child of her own, and a shepherd who rode between them on the seat. Nadine is still up there on the ridge. The house that was meant to be her ending turned out to be the place she finally began. She has a son who comes to the table with clean hands, and a girl she did not birth who calls her something close to mother, and a small wild-haired child who calls her Nan and does not know she was ever anybody's stranger. There is a dog who found her because a man he loved had taught him this ridge was where people came to be saved. There is a box of money that never quite runs out because it turns out a fund built on giving is far harder to empty than one built on keeping. And she has the wren. She keeps it in the same coat pocket she has carried it in for more than half her life. The first one, the one that came wrapped in a note when she had nothing, worn smooth now by 2 hands across 2 lifetimes. Some evenings she takes it out and sets it on the table beside the one she has carved, and she can no longer always tell which one is his and which are hers. And she has decided that is exactly as it should be. She learned the thing you learn last and should have known first. Real family is not the ones who share your blood. It is the ones who keep the fire lit when you cannot. Her son shared her blood and left her in the cold. A stranger she never once met kept her warm through 30 winters and never let her see his face. In the end, that stranger taught her son how to be a son, which is a debt that can never be paid back, only paid forward, quietly, early, before anyone is properly awake. The last of the light goes down gold behind the ridge, the way it did her first evening here, when she stood alone in the yard with a rusted key and everything she owned in one bag, and no idea on earth that she had come home. Beryl lies across her feet. Somewhere down in the dark, a family she will never meet is warm tonight and does not know why. And an old woman sits on a mended porch with a carved bird in her pocket, poor by every measure the world bothers to keep, and richer than she has ever been in her life, and she is not finished yet.